Good morning. Thank you for being here for today's genealogy program. Today is August 13th, 2022. And today's topic is filling the 1890 census gap. A really interesting topic. I'm looking forward to it. I am Jessica Wortman of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. And our program today, as always, will be presented by Terri Meeks. And so I will hand it over to Terri.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us. We have been doing census research, and of course, after 1900, working backwards, you've discovered that there's this 20-year gap. So we're going to take a look first at what exactly happened and how potentially to work around some of the puzzles and missing folks that are lost to us in that gap. The census schedules were stored on wooden shelves in an unlocked room in the basement of the Commerce Building. And what you have to understand at this point is that there was no Census Bureau at the time. That did not come about until 1902. So it wasn't a permanent office with the government. It was just temporary employees, and it was administered by the Department of the Interior. So the other thing is that when it came time to store the census, the Congress had not fully authorized the National Archives. That didn't come about until much later. So they were storing things wherever they could find the space. So, and it's also important to understand that there was a previous fire in March of 1896 that destroyed the special schedules that were part of the 1890 census. The population enumeration was not affected in that fire, but in January of 1921, it definitely was. Smoke was detected in the basement about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was immediately reported. The fire department was immediately called, and they did come in a timely manner. The fire was contained to the basement, but they had put 20 streams of water through holes in the floor that they had to drill through concrete, as well as through some exterior windows. They wound up with a lot of water in the basement, and unfortunately, the 1890 census was stacked just outside of the vault. And so it was the first line that the fire department encountered with their water. It is estimated that 25% was actually destroyed by the fire, and of the remainder, 50% was damaged by water or smoke. At the time, there was no method to restore the writing on water damaged or smoke damaged things. So they just cleaned up the mess. And then what happened? Time passes. So in December of 1932, a list of documents was sent to the Librarian of Congress to determine whether some of the records that had been damaged were vital and whether they should be retained or whether they should be disposed of. The 1890 census happened to be, I believe, item number 24 on the listing. The Library of Congress, the Librarian of Congress reviewed the listing, and after a period of time said sent back to Congress and said, no records are permanent and they do not need to be retained. Therefore, Congress authorized the destruction of those documents, among them the 1890 census. And the complete destruction was finally completed in 1935, some 14 years later. And today we sit there going, oh, why didn't they make a better effort? Why didn't they try? There were approximately 63 million records in the 1890 census. Each family was enumerated on a separate page or pages, depending on how many people were in the family. There are only 1,233 pages that remain today, or fragments of those pages, which include only 6,000 individuals of the 63 million. There are a few pages from each of the states that are listed below. And fortunately, we do have an 1890 Union Veterans and Widows schedule. But alas, that too is just a partial that is from Kentucky through Wyoming. So we're familiar with both the 1880 censuses and the 1900 census pages. Let's take a look at what the 1890 did that might be a little bit unique in that particular year. Line 2 asked whether the person had served in the Civil War. The Civil War had ended 25 years prior, and it was important for pension and other aspects that those that had served in the Civil War were identified. Line 8, were people married during the census year? And that would have been a really critical piece of information, especially for genealogy purposes. If your people had married in that census year and perhaps you couldn't find a marriage record, that's going to give you that clue. Similar to the 1900 census that did follow, we see in line 9 that they asked the mother how many children she had birthed and how many were now living. So that helps you account for any children that might have been born and died in that 10-year interval. For immigrants on line 13, the number of years that they've been living in the United States. So, and lines 22 through 24 were whether they were suffering from disease, were they defective in some way? Don't like that terminology, but it included the blind, deaf, and dumb. And interestingly enough, whether the person was a prisoner. Makes you wonder what society was like at the time. Here is a blank copy of the form, and we notice it was one family per form. If there were more than 5 people in the family, they went to a second page, but we're filling the form out vertically rather than horizontally like we've seen in the later years. Here is one of those surviving pages, and you'll notice the frayed edges. You see some of the watermarks on the edge, but we see our Smith family. We see the head of the family, Corey, his wife, 2 sons, and their daughter. And we have the explanation for their relationship. We see where they were born, where their parents were born. And in the case of the mother, we see that she had birthed 4 children, only 3 of whom were still living. And we see much of the information about employment, what they were doing, whether they were at home. Don't notice whether these kids were at school or not, and what language they speak. Here is another one that seems to be in a little bit better situation, our status. And we see a couple, and we see the brother of Mr. Gannon. We see their ages, where they were born, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, but their parents were from Ireland. So it would be very, very helpful if this information had survived. There was a huge influx of immigrants in the 1880s, and we miss several of these people and the recording of them. The 1890 Union Veterans and Widows Schedule also survived. There are approximately 75,000 names in this, and some Confederate soldiers and widows did make it into the schedule. In a lot of cases, it depended on where they were living at the time after the Civil War. So they might have been recorded in Kansas, Wyoming, North Dakota, even though they had originally come from the South. These were, the census was specifically taken to help with pension claims and to allow the government to know how many veterans were still alive, and that they would have to provide benefits for, and that they could come up with pension legislation. And as we saw earlier, Kentucky through Wyoming is the only records that survive. The Alabama through the first half of Kentucky were actually lost. The Veterans Schedule records the name of not only those that served in the Army, but those that were in the Navy, Marines, and of course, the widows of any of these people who served. It does give their rank and their information about the regiment that they served in. It gives the dates of their enlistment and their discharge, and calculates the length of their service. At the bottom, their post office address occurs. So that's one of the key items. We get an actual address for a post office as opposed to a street address on the other census information. Whether or not they had incurred some form of disability during their service, whether they were wounded, whether they had consequences as a result of their fighting. So, and there was also a very short area for enumerator remarks. Here is one of those schedules. And we can see here that Mr. Lutz, we have some ditto marks underneath him. So we see that he has served in 3 different units during his service of the Civil War. And it gives what company he was in and what regiment he was in and the length of service in each of those. And we see that he has been promoted as he went along. We also find that Belle Morganroth is the widow of Reuben Parker. So in the intervening years, Her husband was killed in the Civil War and she has remarried. So a potential clue there if someone has gone missing. And we also see a Mr. Frank Bruning, whose alias was Frank Bruner. So did one of your ancestors perhaps change their name even ever so slightly during the Civil War? And we see finally in the last line that Mr. I guess it's Gipperick, he served in the 1st Virginia Cavalry. So he is probably one of those Confederate soldiers that is now living in a northern state. We have the listing. I'm trying to find my cursor. Oops, excuse me. We have the listing of their addresses on the bottom left, and we see some of the injuries that they might have sustained, whether they were wounded, whether they have a recurring condition that has prevented them from working in the future, and any other notes that have been added. So try to make sure that if you do have a relative that might have served in the Civil War, that you try to find some of these records. They will lead to other pension records and perhaps other secrets will be revealed. So let's start thinking about what are some of the substitute records that we can use in place of that 1890 census. Fortunately, some of the states and territories did conduct censuses in the intervening years. These were done on a state-by-state basis, so not every state did them. Not every state did them in the alternating years of the 5s, the 85s, 95s, et cetera. We'll look at a listing of these. Census, another great census substitute is city directories. These were usually put out every year, so you can trace your family every single year going through these. And we'll take a look at some of those and the clues that they might give to you. If your people did not live in a city, there might be a business directory or a county directory that you can look at that might give you similar information. Vital and church records. Church records for births and baptisms, as well as deaths and burials. They will potentially record marriage records. Vital records, the actual birth and death certificates, in many states did not come about until the 1920s. So that doesn't help us much in the 1890s, but those church records might. Many of the New England states and some of the northern states did have birth, marriage, and death registers, so you might want to look at those. School census records. When your children went to school, there might have been a census taken there. It will at least record an approximate age and hopefully give you some additional information about the family. Did someone in your family enlist during that later time period? And they might have gotten lost. We did have the Spanish-American War, so some of the National Guard units went off to that, as well as regular military service records. And those that had served during the Civil War, there should be pension records, whether they are just applications or whether there are pension payments. Newspapers, again, rather than an annual occurrence, these are a daily occurrence. So don't forget to look for your people in newspapers. Cemetery records. Families lived in pretty much the same local areas, and when they died, they were buried in plots that were near to one another. So if you find something on Find a Grave for one of your relatives, look at the whole cemetery, not just by name for the one individual that you're looking for. In many cases, Find a Grave records those people that had tombstones, but not necessarily those that didn't. Tax and voter registration lists. These are few and far between, and many of them are not on the internet, but sometimes they will leave a valuable clue for you. And of course, double check those records that you might have in your own home. Do you have a family Bible, a diary that was recorded by someone, or a scrapbook? Do you have immigration papers? There might be something that you might have, or even a photograph that you might have in your own home. So let's look at the state and territorial censuses. First, as the thing, not all states took them. It was interesting to read that states were actually paid to take state censuses, but in some cases still, they did not do it. Those states that did take them did not always do them on a 10-year basis. They did not always do them in years ending in 5. And if they did do them, not necessarily all counties were covered in those censuses, but it pays you to look for them. And we're going to look at a few of the examples, and we'll see that the actual forms are very, very different depending on the state. Some of them are on the internet at Ancestry and at Family Search. Many of them have been recorded in books that are at state archives or at state libraries. Here is a listing of those that took them in that 85 and 95, as well as New York that decided to do it a little bit differently in 1892. These records are online at both Ancestry and Family Search. These are some of the other states that did take state censuses in those intervening years. However, to the best of my knowledge, I went looking, I could not find any of these records online. So these are the ones that are going to be in those state and state libraries and archives. And it's worth a call or a letter to try and see if you can get some information from them. Here's an example of an 1885 Colorado census. You'll note that it's very, very similar to an 1880 census in that we've got the names, we've got family members kind of grouped together, we have ages, and we do have what their relationship is to the head of the family, occupations, and the nativity of the people, where they were born, where their parents were born. And we notice in Colorado that a lot of these people have migrated here. So if your people moved, if they disappear from 1900 and you have questions, you might want to look to see if you can find them in a state census somewhere earlier. On a very, very different scale, here's an 1895 South Dakota census. And we do see a family group together, but we only see simple information like the ages of the people. There is no relationship information, although we can guess, and very, very sketchy as far as their nativity. Their nationality is more asking about their Native American ancestry. Here is an example from the 1892 New York State Census. Here again, very, very plain. We've got names of the folks, males and females, their ages, where they were born, and what their occupations are. But it's very interesting to note that we have a 10-year-old in this family. We have a 12-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 4-year-old. Are these people still alive in the 1900 census? Or are these some of those children that may have died, born and died in that intervening 20-year period? So make sure to check your state censuses. City directories. They list the people in an exact place in those intervening years, and they are annually. I personally had to use city directories and go annually, year by year by year, to establish a relationship of a family that I suspected the wife had remarried into a family that had other children. And it was in doing that and realizing that these people all lived at the same address that I was able to confirm the relationship. They give the addresses of home, and in many cases, exactly where they're working. They might identify who they are working for. So potentially some additional valuable information to add to your family history. In many cases, they include the spouse's name in parentheses, the woman's name. Frequently, women are lost in other records. And don't forget to look at the advertisements. There are advertisements sprinkled throughout, as well as a listing of businesses at the beginning or at the end. So, and organizations as well. You know, did one of your relatives belong to the Knights of Columbus, the Knights of Pythias? That information will be recorded in a city directory and potentially lead you to other sources. Here's one from 1883 in West Troy, New York, which then later on became Watervliet, New York. So the town name changed. Just so that no one is confused by GI thinking that they might be a military person. This is an abbreviation for a small town called Green Island. So no confusion there. But we see an alphabetical listum. We see a Mrs. Catherine Gorman. We see that Martin Gorman died on July 7th, 1882. This is early on, so there's probably not going to be a death certificate for him. A valuable piece of information. He's going to disappear and not be in that 1900 census. We do have where their homes are, where they are boarding. We do see that Sarah is a widow. Let's see. We have another one where Henry has died in 1882, the previous year. And we see that Mary is a widow. Here's another example from Toledo, Ohio, and we see that someone has moved to Louisville, Kentucky. We see other notes to see an additional page for further information. And you see where someone, William J. McCartney, is the manager at this particular firm. So, and again, we have the moving and where these people are moving to. Extremely helpful information. I mentioned to look in the back, or sometimes they're in the front, but you might want to scan the pages for actual occupations. From previous census information from 1900, you might realize that someone in your family was, for example, a photographer. So you might want to look there and verify the information that in 1890, they were still a photographer in, for example, Rochester, New York, and exactly where their business was located. There are also some unique occupations, pattern makers. I don't know whether this occupation still exists today, but we also have the making of patterns for boots and shoes and different, as opposed to dress pattern makers. So scan these to see if you might find one of your ancestors. I have no idea what a paste manufacturer is and how steam is different from anything else. There are also examples for specific advertisements, but they list who the president was, who the vice president was, and who the treasurer is in these. Is it possible that your person might have worked for a tobacco company or a pipe manufacturer and might have been an officer in the company? Vital in church records. It's so important to look for the births, marriages, and deaths in that intervening 20-year period. People may have gotten married in that intervening year. So in 1900, you may find a family group together, whereas you lose them. How do you know where to find them in 1880? The same with children. In my particular case, I have found several children that were born and died in those intervening years, and they never would have made it to any kind of census. Here is a birth from 1895. Fortunately, if she was still alive, she might appear in a 1900 census. But if she wasn't, and in some cases, these birth records will record what number the child was, that this might be the third child born to the woman. This particular one doesn't, but many of them do. In this case, the family are immigrants. The parents are immigrants. Did they immigrate in that 1880 to 1900 time frame, so that you then get their information to go backwards to try and find them? Here's one of the marriage register that I was talking about earlier from this particular area of Michigan. And it is from 1887. It gives the dates of the marriages and the couple who are getting married. In many cases, they will give parents' names. So here again, finding that woman's maiden name would be key and critical, and it might appear in a marriage register. Hopefully the marriage was still intact in 1900 so that you might find these people, but an entire family might be established during that time. Here's a death record. It's not exactly the best example because the man is 84 years old, so he would have been born about 1810. But again, we see that he's going to die in 1894. He's not going to be present in the 1900 census. So if you've lost a relative or gained a relative, you might want to check out these records. Church records are a wonderful source. In some cases, those records, for example, the Catholic Church, might be in Latin from Salem in the Boston Diocese, the St. Joseph Church. And we see this baby being born in 1891 on the 15th of January, and it gives her parents. Here again, we have immigrants. So perhaps in going backwards to 1880, we need to look at these places in Quebec. Here's a group of baptisms from the Presbyterian Church for 1887. And unfortunately, it doesn't list the ages. So we assume that these are infant baptisms, but it gives parents' names. Hopefully it gives you more than just Mr. and Mrs. You get a clue as to what that first name is to verify the information you might have found in 1900. This is a marriage record from 1891 in a Lutheran church. And unfortunately, in many cases, we do not see parents' names on many of these records, but we do at least get the woman's maiden name. I have seen some of these records, unfortunately, that just have initials, so that we have C.J. Carlson marrying B. Johansson. So additional work, and we'll talk about that in our conclusions. Here's another Presbyterian church, marriages. And in this particular one, it's a little bit confusing because they say that Sophie is getting married, but it seems that her name is being affixed to her husband. We don't get her maiden name, but it says that she's being married in her mother's home, at the home of the bride. So one of these relatives that's listed down here is apt to be her mother or her parents. And we see other ones that from the parish where people are getting married in the 1890s and establishing those families. Here's a baptism record that is from that time period, but we see a marginal note that says that Joseph is going to marry and where he's going to marry. This record is from, I believe it's the Boston area, but he's going to get married in Quebec, Canada to Apolline Fortin. So look for the clues that might be included in these. Another Lutheran church, and this is funerals from 1897. And you will notice, with the exception of these two people, all of these are children that would never be recorded in a census, born in 1882 1885, 1886. So these would be some of those lost people. School records, just like with the marriages and the births, or the marriages where an entire family could be created over a 20-year period, a child could receive their entire education in that 20-year period. Many school records are just simple school listings, and we will see several examples of those, especially from this 1890 timeframe. Sometimes, and especially later on, you will get the listing of parents or guardians. So hopefully if a child entered school in the late 1890s, you may find a school record in the 1900s that gives this additional information. And they may show groupings of siblings. Here's a listing from 1887 from the Canyon City School. And it doesn't give ages, but it does, I apologize for the lightness of the image, but it does break down into children between 6 and 16 years old. So those younger children might have been born in the 1880 timeframe. They might also have passed away before the 1900 census. And look for similar names, because while they may not be siblings, they may be cousins or possibly related to each other in some other way. Here's one from the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Indian School. And these, we see a listing of young people. Here again, some of those that are under the age of 12, where they might have appeared in an 1880 census. And in the many cases, these are Native American children who have been sent to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So they are not in their home states necessarily. They entered in 1889. So they've been in this school for 3 years at this point in time. Some of them have been sent back home, and it does list a name of a guardian that they have been sent back to. The others have remained in the school. So if you have any Native American ancestry, this might be a critical source of information. Here's an Oklahoma school census for the time. And we do see a group of children that are probably siblings with one another. We have Wilma and Orville, probably siblings. But we notice in this particular family that all of these children potentially were born in 1880 or later. Where were they in 1900? That Mamie would have been 20 years old by 1900, and she might have been married by that time. Military service records. The Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurrection came about in 1898 and were very, very short conflicts, but people did enlist and go to fight. So look for enlistment records for those that might have disappeared. You might find them in 1880, but they get lost in 1900. You also want to look for the compiled service records of those that might have served in the Civil War and any pension records for that time frame. And these records are available through the subscription service of Fold 3 that is available at local family history centers. They're also on Ancestry, and they are available from the National Archives. Here's an 1890 military enlistment register, and we see the names of the men that are enlisting and the date of their enlistment, where they are actually enlisting from, and who is doing the enlisting. We see where they were born, how old they are, what their former occupation was. So if you see soldier, they are re-enlisting. They probably have served elsewhere. And we get a description of their hair, their eyes, and what their complexion is. Don't forget to look at page 2 of that same form, and it tells what unit they were actually assigned to and what company, the period of the length of service that they're going to serve, and we get other sets of information about their actual unit. Read the comments. In this case, most of these people were being discharged at the end of their service. If they served in Cuba, the Philippines, or another military establishment during that 1900 census, there was a military census specifically done in the 1900s. However, many of these people may not appear. They may have been lost in that 1900 census. So some of this information may be valuable. If the person died during their service, it will be recorded in these remarks. You might also want to look for a widow's pension as a result of the Civil War. This is one for one of my relatives, but it gave some additional information that I did not know about. Mary Gunnan, she's the widow that is applying for the pension of Daniel. He served in the 7th New York Heavy Artillery during the Civil War, and he died in 1893. What was interesting was that she was married under the name Mary Flanagan, and that both of them had been married previously. I did not know that information. Working backwards from 1900, I did not have that fact. There are 2 children that are underage and will qualify to receive pension benefits. And you'll note that the one was born in 79, the next in 89, so might have disappeared. Newspapers. Newspapers record the events from daily life, so you might be able to find something very, very specific. We've got the visits to and from family. Somebody went to town just to buy groceries. All of these are recorded in social columns. Births, weddings, funerals, reunions, anniversaries. Look for those kinds of treasures. There are also things like real estate transfers or court cases. You never know what you might find in a newspaper. And as we've talked about the Spanish-American War, the newspapers really, really recorded, especially photography at this time was prominent during the Civil War. One of the examples, Chronicling America, is from the Library of Congress. It's a free website, and Historic Colorado Newspapers also has free access to Colorado newspapers. I apologize for the quality of this image, but it is one that's just from social columns. The remains of Mrs. Kitty Dearborn, who died. And, so this is from the 1880s, and we are going to get her death recorded. The citizens of Deer Trail are being terrorized by Newt Vorse and his gang. So, was Newt Vorse one of your relatives, or did someone in your family live in Deer Creek at this particular time? It adds that flavor to your family history. We've got a marriage in the First Baptist Church. We've got the attorney that is working on that Newt Vorse case. And we see an accident that has happened to Mr. Force. And he's going to be laid up for a while. So those little tidbits, but it places your person at a particular point in a particular time. Oops. Here's a wedding announcement from 1890. Miss Anna Deer, she's the daughter of Charles Deer, the founder of the Deer Manufacturing Company for farm equipment. So this is probably a very prominent family that is not going to get lost in the census. But just in case, check out those marriage records for your family. Here's an example that my relative that actually died in 1893, I found out by looking at the newspaper that he had been sworn in as one of the assessors of the town in the year 1885. So another tidbit of information to add to his story. Legal notices. This one happens to be also from my family, and a simple Google search in these newspapers. This one happens to come from the Library of Congress website, that Chronicling America. And we see where Maurice Cooney is suing, he's versus Leo V. Cooney. And it's over the estate of James Cooney, who died in 1897. So we get when we're going to find out when this person died, and we're going to see potentially other newspaper articles about the disposition of this case. And there are other records. Cemetery records. We've talked about how families cluster together in neighborhoods or in areas. So you want to explore not only looking, for example, at Find a Grave, you want to look at the entire cemetery. One of the other things about an on-site visit is you really want to visit the cemetery office and obtain what is called a lot card. It will give you a listing of all the people that are buried in the plot. In larger areas, larger cities, you may find that multiple people are buried in a plot, and those will be recorded on the lot card. They also have burial maps, and they will list the people that are in unmarked graves. Here's an example from Find a Grave. We just have a little girl, Agnes Jane Connolly, who was probably about 5 or 6 years old when she died. We have the information as to what section of the cemetery she's born in. So you want to look at the whole cemetery. This one happens to be a huge one in, I believe it's New York City area. So there are 469 matches just for the family named Connolly. But if you have the patience to go through and verify and look at the section numbers, the rows and the plots to find similar areas where your people may be buried, you may find those that might have been born and died in those intervening years, or who died in that 1880 to 1900 time frame. Here's an example of a family tombstone. And unfortunately, the dates do not fall into that 1880 to 1900 in terms of the death. They're much later. But we do see where multiple people are buried in a single area. It's when you get the lot card. These are the 3 names recorded on the tombstone. When you get the lot card, we find that there are actually 12 burials in that area. And these people are all related. We see a couple of different surnames, 3 different surnames, but we see a 19-day-old baby. So even though it's 1918 that he's dying, we find a 10-month-old dying in 1922. These 2 children would never have appeared in a census. Estelle may or may not have appeared in a census. So try and get the lot cards. Tax lists. Tax lists were not required by all counties, and many of them have not been saved. Many of them have been destroyed, and they are definitely not all online, but they are useful for locating your ancestor and giving you an idea of the circumstances that they are living in. Are they paying a lot of tax? Are they paying a little tax? A couple of these records are online, and some of them are also available at state libraries and archives. This is a listing of delinquent poll taxes from, I can't remember exactly which year. It's covered up. Anyway, we see that everybody owed $2 to pay for the schools in their poll tax. And we see that people are paying it at a later date and how much they paid and when they paid it. So you know that your person is living in this particular county at this particular intervening time, the 1890s. Voter registration lists. These are even fewer and farther between, but they may provide information for you that you did not know heretofore. They do give the name, the country of birth, the date and place of naturalization, how long they've been living there, what their current address is. And here again, they're available at state libraries and archives. This one is from Chicago, and it's just people named Smith. We've got their address. We have their names, where they were actually born. And we see several of them have moved into the state. They have the residence, and this is what's interesting, how long they've lived in the actual precinct, how long they may have lived in the county, and how long they may have lived in the state. And we do have their citizenship information, if they are a native of the United States or if they were foreign born. We see England, we see Germany, and their citizenship, the date that they have filed their papers. And if you go further to the right, I apologize, I cut it off. It has the court in which they have filed their citizenship papers. And citizenship can be done in any of the courts in any of the states. So that is extremely valuable information. Finally, we have some of those miscellaneous records. We've got the immigration, and we've got the stuff that you might have at home. Here's an 1887 immigration, a ship list, and we see some young people, but we see an entire family down here with young people that were born in that 1880 time frame. And the question is, are they still surviving in 1900? Did they go on to marry and establish families? So, or were they lost in that 20-year interval? This was an unusual record that I found. It's a certificate to travel abroad. And it turns out this is for a man who was an immigrant, and he wished to travel abroad with his family, his wife and 5 children. And he has been naturalized. He is a citizen. I expected maybe to find a passport, but instead I found a certificate of travel abroad. So here again, just do those Google searches or do those searches through Ancestry or Family Search and look at all the possible areas where records might show up. Family Bibles. We see this is a very old and sad, taped back together family Bible, but we see where people were born in the 1840s, and we see these young people born in the 1880s as well as later. We don't know their relationships exactly because we see different family names, Chastain, Ray, Gilmore, but it helps you to piece together your family. By the same token, deaths may be recorded. Mrs. N.C. Gilmore died in 1896, so as well as some later deaths. Ancestry has grouped together the census fragments, the veteran schedules, city directories, and state into an 1890 census substitute database. So if you go to this and enter your person's name, it will come up with these various records that they might appear in. When you're looking at records, especially in this intervening time, try to look at all of the records. We typically look for our individual person by name. When you find that person, browse, keep looking. Families did cluster together, so there might be additional records for other family members simply by advancing 5 pages or going back 5 pages, and you might find some clues there. Use the card catalog that is available on both Ancestry and Family Search. Enter location names, enter family names, especially in Family Search. There might be a book that has been published about your family lineage. Just try and think of all the ways that you might find something in that 1880 to 1900 gap that might be listed in the card catalog. You can look for specific titles, or you can look for specific keywords. If there are county histories or land transactions, Did your people move during that time frame? Look at land records working backwards. When did they sell their land and when did they move to the new place? City directories might give you those clues. We saw those that said removed to. Finally, assess what you already know. We work backwards in working with the census. So in 1900, what do you already know about your family? What did somebody get married? How old were they in the 1900 census? And make some guesses about what you want to look for and what you want to find. Exactly what is it? Did somebody get lost in the census? Did somebody move? What were the circumstances? And what is it that you want to find for your person? As we've talked, no single record other than maybe the state census is going to replace the census record and where you're going to see the family connections, that family unit. We know who the children are. They are specified as sons and daughters. Wives are specified with the head of the household. And we don't get that in 1880. We do see people all living together, but we don't have that specific designation. So all of these other records that we find are partial substitutes. They're going to give you the clues. Did somebody get married and they're in a marriage register, but you don't have the parents' names? So in this case, you want to just gather multiple pieces of evidence. Try to find them in multiple of these documents to provide the full evidence that it is indeed your family that you are doing the work for. And if there are any questions, I will turn it over at this particular time.
Well, thank you, Terry. It doesn't look like we have any questions just at the moment, but I would like to encourage all of the viewers, if you do have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat feed real quick. Just the button there at the bottom, it looks like the speaking bubble, and we'll be happy to answer that. We love hearing from you guys. So any thoughts or comments would be great. And then so onto my own comments, a couple of things came up. First of all, Terry, thank you for giving us hope and finding records during that time period. A lot of times we lean so heavily on the census gap. And so you give us a lot of great ideas on other ways to find that information. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from today, what you shared, was really just expanding out and kind of thinking outside the box and looking beyond just that family member's name that you're looking for. And you can find so much information and like you said, like little hints and little tidbits that you might not have thought of before. So that's really good. And then you mentioned the social announcements, and it made me think I've seen that with the Canyon City Daily Records, looking at the old ones, and some of them are so funny. But you can learn a lot from those because as you had mentioned, it will talk about just what people are up to. And a lot of times I've seen during the holidays, they really will give a good list of the relatives that are visiting and where they're visiting from. So, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so on such and such Macon Avenue have, these people name the people they're visiting from Denver, and it'll say it right there in the paper. So that was a really good point. Another thing that came up for me was when you're speaking of the use of initials, and that sometimes they don't even put the full name out and just the initials, and how quickly that can get confusing. Well, what it made me think of within my own family, my mom's family is really big. And she's got 58 cousins, I think, on one side. And so there's several sets of cousins within there that have the same names. They wanted to name them after the grandparents. And so That can get really confusing fast. And so I was just thinking, if you come across that and you're not sure if it's one and the same, to really flag that in your research to avoid further muddying the water. But that also made me think on my dad's side, his dad's name was David Wesley, and then his brother was Wesley something. And I don't know why they named both of them Wesley, but they did. So anyhow. That's all I had on that. Thank you. And did we get any questions? Nobody chimed in. That's okay. We appreciate you being here. We will see you next month, so September 17th for cemetery records. And then also I'd like to invite everyone to the community coffee this month at the museum. It's August 26th. And this month's topic will be on movies. And so you may know a lot of movies have been filmed in the area. If you have any memories of movies being filmed, if you or anyone you know was an extra in a movie, any fun stories to share, please come on down. It's August 26th, and it's a Friday at the museum, 9 a.m. Thank you.